Welcome to Millennials Meet Liberty, your source for searing hot libertarian takes on the world's weekly headlines. Here's your host, Colt Thompson.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 10th edition of Millennials Meet Liberty. Yes, that's right. We're at number 10, finally double-digit episode, so I guess we got a long ways to go until we get to the coveted triple digits or a hundo, but happy to have made it this far. So here I am, your host, Colt Thompson, excited to bring you some different content this week. What I wanted to talk about, since we were basically on the the backdrop, or we're on the back end of the election cycle. It just transpired this past week. This week was election week, and moreover, Tuesday was election day here in the United States for some certain coveted gubernatorial seats and Senate seats, and even all the way down to the local municipality, county judge, dog catcher type position. So on the, like I said, the back end of all of this, some interesting stuff shook out, but what I wanted to predominantly focus this episode on was a differentiation between the states of Texas and New York economically. So I know that sounds kind of like a random topic, but despite all of the election results that occurred over the past week, this is normally what you see in any election cycle. I mean, there's nothing drastically different about what occurred this time around. Nothing that was quite shocking other than the fact that in Kentucky, I believe a Democrat took over the governorship, which some people actually blame us here in the Liberty movement for that, as it pertains to libertarians commanding a bigger percentage of the vote than usual, which probably would go towards a Republican candidate, but for the libertarian vote. So that swung it in the direction of a Democrat. But despite this news, and despite the election news, I really wanted to talk about, again, the differentiation between the states of Texas and New York, because what also transpired was not just the election of candidates per se, but also implementation of certain policies. So one policy, or law that was voted on, or an amendment, I don't know exactly what they call it down in Texas, was the really just the passage of barring the income tax from ever really coming to existence in the state of Texas. So Texas is one of the few, maybe there's about 7 or 8 states in the United States that have no state income tax. Texas was already one of those states, so they bottomed out at 0. And I've actually lived in Texas. I lived there for 2 short years. I lived in Dallas for 1 year, and I lived in Houston. Just a state I really fell in love with in my time there, but had to move on for other business reasons. But basically, them doing this and voting to do that, to me, was a huge victory for liberty-minded folks and just liberty down there in Texas, or Tejas, as some of the people call it down there. So I wanted to take some time to talk about how that'll impact the state a little bit going forward, and really compare that, use that as a litmus test, or a barometer, so to speak, to that of other states, but namely New York State, because I think there's some drastic differences in economic and a little social policy in New York State versus that of Texas. And it should come as no surprise that New York State has been very, very much struggling and suffering economically in the past 10, 20, 30 years. Whereas Texas has been succeeding and thriving and adding citizens basically in droves, hands over fists, the past 10, 20, 30 years. So in economics, there's a lot of cyclical action that happens on a worldwide stage and a global stage, but also cyclical in terms of states therein, so like here in the United States. So I believe that what's going on in New York State and what's going on in Texas is just a microcosm of what's going on in the world as a whole, with maybe China and the United States, or some of these more heavy up-and-coming industrialized nations versus the service sector-based United States at this point. So I just want to shed some light on why some people are moving to Texas, why people are leaving New York. And this can be really a generalization of as to why these other types of things are happening in the United States, with states like North Carolina and Tennessee versus those of like California or Massachusetts, moreover. So I'm already drawing this distinction of blue states and red states, and that's not a coincidence, economically speaking. So let's flesh this out a little bit. So Texas and New York are two of the biggest by population states in the United States. Texas is firmly at number 2 behind that of California, and New York is firmly at number 4 directly behind Florida. An interesting point I would note is that New York held the number 3 spot for a long, long time, and just recently, I think in the past 18 months, forfeited that spot to the state of Florida, and there's a lot that could be said about that. I mean, there's a lot of snowbirds who have moved to Florida, or halfbacks from New York who have moved from Florida, didn't quite like that and ended up in maybe North Carolina, so somewhere in the middle of the coast there. But it should come as no surprise that Florida passed New York, since a lot of the citizens of New York moved to Florida for tax sheltering purposes, real estate purposes, and opportunity purposes, despite just the nice weather down there. And I could talk about that for days because actually, in fact, our president, Commander-in-Chief Donald Trump, actually just this past week as well, this is such a coincidence, ended up moving from New York, I guess claiming that as his primary domicile, to Florida for really just tax implications. But let's circle back and again focus on New York and Texas. So Texas, number 2 in population, New York, number 4. So it was a pretty good comparison there. And we've seen that these populations have been moving in really opposite directions. So while New York might be growing at a sluggish pace overall, upstate New York is getting absolutely hammered. It's been cataclysmic what's happened to the economy up there. It's just a shell of itself from when it was an industrial jewel and powerhouse, really spurring and being the heartbeat of the Industrial Revolution of the United States. New York was at one point just a fucking powerhouse. And even manufacturing, as far as I think Kodak started in Rochester, New York, and was a preeminent power there, all the way through other manufacturing companies in steel and in electronics and in all sorts of different industries across the state of New York. People don't realize that New York's actually pretty agrarian-based as well. So currently right now there's a lot of yogurt manufacturing facilities. I think Chobani's headquarters is in upstate New York. So there's still some lifeblood, I guess, so to speak, with manufacturing in terms of food and beverage manufacturing. But short of that, most of the steel, car, auto, anything that really was the backbone of the United States economy is pretty much just left upstate New York and is continuing to happen. We see these shuttering of factories. But thinking again about this whole situation as we see Texas, on the other hand, which is absolutely booming in terms of manufacturing. And again, this is relative. This is not on a global scale, but compared to other states in the United States. And a lot of people who work in manufacturing end up in the state of Texas because there are car companies opening down there. There are bottling facilities opening down there. There are things pertaining to space exploration surrounding that of NASA and even private enterprise popping up down there. So overall, Texas is just one of these places that is a real boon for oil production and natural gas and just all sorts of industries that are really very productive in the eyes of economists. So you can already tell the landscapes are already gloomy in New York versus very prosperous and exciting. And I guess that versus the ominous outlook there in New York State. So New York City is squeaking by, adding people every day. But right now there's been a sense of urgency for people to actually escape New York City, even if they have a job there and maybe live in Jersey City, just because the cost is that much cheaper, or adjacent towns, or even states like Connecticut or New Jersey, even though they themselves are not very cheap to live in. So it's a beast here. We have kind of New York City is its own thing. We have the whole state of New York, and then we have really the whole state of Texas. So the dynamics at place here are New York State has New York City, which is growing, but that's really by virtue of the really just the historical financial aspects of that city. I think there's maybe 100 of the Fortune 500 headquarters based in New York City. And every time someone comes to the United States from Europe, oftentimes they end up landing in New York City at one of the 2 airports, LaGuardia or JFK. So there's kind of this built-in everlast effect of really industry in New York City that kind of won't go away for, I guess, traditionalist reasons, like the New York Stock Exchange and a lot of the trading action that goes on in the world and globally happens in New York City. So there's some built-in things with New York, kind of like just the idea of Ellis Island, to the extent that some immigrants come in from not Mexico or south of the border, that they come in from Europe or they come in as a refugee from the Middle East. A lot of them end up coming to New York and settling there, and there's hundreds of languages spoken there, and it's pretty diverse. Definitely the most diverse city in the United States, actually short of Houston, which surpassed New York. And again, that's a good point for this because that's predominantly Hispanic people. But really, New York City is truly the most diverse city, and especially in terms of languages and culture and all of those things. But the rest of the state, basically, this situation is like a microcosm of DC and the United States. So DC sucks up, absorbs all of the resources, and it should come as no surprise that over 10 of the 20 most wealthiest counties in the United States are situated around DC. And that's because all the resources are being sucked up from tax revenue all over the country and coming into D.C. It's just this Leviathan. Well, the same dynamic happens in New York State. Basically, New York City controls Albany, which is the capital of New York, while Albany is more upstate. It doesn't really matter. So the politicians from New York City, they come up to Albany and they pass all this legislation. It benefits New York City, and it completely shits all over upstate New York and just destroys what, again, was a crown jewel of manufacturing and free enterprise back in the day. And it's funny because New York State is very agriculturally based. It's very scenic. It has one of the seven wonders of the world, Niagara Falls. It has the Adirondacks, which is the biggest state park in the United States, spanning 6.1 million acres. You can fit Yosemite and the Grand Canyon within there and still have a lot of room left over. So New York City basically leaves upstate New York to die, kind of like DC leaves the rest of the nation to die in relative terms. And New York City, draws all of this wealth and takes all of these resources from upstate New York and just really pillages people in upstate New York. And that's why there's a threat for New York State to divide into 2 or 3 distinct states. And I think the term they were going to call upstate New York is New Amsterdam if they followed through with all of this. But who really knows what the call would be there as far as a name goes. But New York State could definitely split into 2, much like California dividing itself into 2 or 3 states, which would really improve the economic outlook of New York State, I guess specifically upstate New York. But anyway, so you have that dynamic in place in New York. And then you have in Texas, pretty much it's a little more uniform in the sense that there's San Antonio, there's Houston, there's Dallas, there's Fort Worth. There's probably 25 of the top 100 fastest growing cities in the United States are in the state of Texas. And I think of the top 25, maybe like 5 of them are therein. I mean, Houston's definitely there, Dallas is there, San Antonio's there, Austin is there. This should come as no surprise. So there's blanket common sense coming out of the capital, out of Austin, and the leadership and legislature there. It's kind of funny to call politicians common sense worthy, but that's really what you have in Texas versus that of New York, as far as policies coming out of Austin versus those coming out of Albany in New York, which are really coming out of New York City. So what does this really manifest itself into? Well, New York State has roughly, if they don't have number 1 in all of this, they certainly have number 2 or 3. They have the most laws. They have the most tax burden. They have the most business unfriendly environment pretty much ever to exist in the United States. There's so much red tape. It's about impossible to start a business in New York without encumbering yourself with a slew of taxes and regulations and hurdles and all sorts of trade, vocational stuff and boxes you need to check to get through to starting a business in New York, on top of the ever-increasing sales tax and income taxes and all these brackets. So you have a tax boondoggle, you have a regulatory boondoggle, you have a straight shit show in terms of lawmakers and all of their fodder in terms of social justice action that further encumbers businesses and makes it downright scary to do business because you could be legally fucking stonewalled or stoned to death by some social justice activist who thinks you're not doing something in an appropriate way, and New York State will come in there and crack some skulls. So New York just is a totally different dynamic from Texas. I mean, there's red flag laws in New York. There's the toughest gun laws in the entire country in New York, with the SAFE Act, which is really just alienating upstate New Yorkers who are very, again, rural and country oriented and more, I guess, like I said, there's more farmers, and it's just it's a different dynamic. It's more closer to Appalachia than it is fucking New York City in terms of upstate New York. I mean, upstate New York is redder than Alabama. I mean, it is the Mecca. I think it commanded Trump's vote more than any other area in the United States. That being said, though, I mean, so you see all of these laws coming out of New York, all the regulations, all of the taxes, and it is driving people out of the state. And I'll explain that in a second. But Texas is literally the converse of that. They just bottomed out the income tax forever into perpetuity. That's amazing. And they have pretty much no zoning laws relative to New York, and their other tax burdens are completely lowered. And then they have, of course, these immigrants coming in droves. It's not by choice, but they are. And then it's just, you look around and all these businesses are popping up and all these people are moving there. And there's a ton of people from California and a ton of people from New York and just the coast overall. And it's like, why is this? How can this be? I mean, Texas is flat. It's hot. Like, what is the fucking deal here? Why is this happening? I mean, New York State is a hell of a lot more beautiful than Texas. Granted, there's the seasons up there, but that's not why people leave. I mean, maybe retirees. It's because there's no opportunity. So let's just, again, look at all of this. What on earth could possibly be going on? I said this is cyclical for a reason. It's because at one point in time, New York, back in the day, in the heyday of the Industrial Revolution, had lower taxes. They had lower regulations. It was a friendly area to do business, and that's why it built itself up to become a power. It had Buffalo, it had Rochester, it had Syracuse, it had Utica, it had Rome, it had Binghamton, it had Albany. It had all these cities that kind of were like really well known in the colonial era and beyond. Even like people west of the Mississippi River have heard of these cities. And what you saw is these newer states on the frontier in the Western world develop out in the Colorados and the Arizonas and the Utahs and all this, and the Texases. What they did is they basically just reinvented the formula that New York had. It had the low tax, get yourself some land with minimal property taxes and have at it and basically control your own destiny. And while this is going on, the New England states and moreover New York were like, well, we don't necessarily know about that. I think we're going to start looking at what the needy here need, and we're going to start giving them things. And then you have this giant welfare state that's born out of this. And then all of a sudden you're kicking people out of the state by accident, because it's not like people just want to pick up and they want to leave where they're from. Most people take pride in where they're from and they're happy about where they're from. And now you just have a bunch of jaded upstate New Yorkers all pissed off, and New York City slickers pissed off on how much money they're paying just to live there and scrape by. But it's really bizarre, because what it is this: any state or any area in the world, because like I said, what's going on in New York and Texas is a microcosm of what's going on with China and the United States. So China, labor is cheaper. China has a less cumbersome tax structure. China is a more welcoming place for entrepreneurship and businesses and factories and manufacturing facilities and warehouses, all of these things. And like I said, Texas is the same thing. They pretty much have side-by-side analysis. They have all of these things that New York does not have in terms of what would lure and attract or seduce entrepreneurs to come in and build their businesses and hire workers. So when businesses come in, all they really care about is, what is the tax burden? What is the regulatory burden? What is the area where I can most cheaply make my goods, manufacture my goods, deliver my services, and disperse them all over, I guess, potentially the globe. And Texas wins every single time versus New York. So it shouldn't come as a surprise. So when a business pops up, out of that lures the necessity to bid up the price of labor, and wages go up, and people come in, and people want to work there. And then an offshoot of that is other businesses pop up around there, and it bids up this process of escalating labor and payroll and wages going out there, and people are happy because there's an abundance of opportunity and there's a lot of jobs, and the jobs are paying more than where they were from. And everyone's like, you know what, this is a pretty sweet life. And then a byproduct of that is all of these government buildings and streets and cities in Texas are fucking excellently clean. And people will be like, well, what is that all about? How does that make any sense? They don't have as much tax. They don't have as high taxes in these areas, in these cities and states. Well, it's because these businesses that are coming in, it's basically broaden the base, lower the tax, and next thing you know, all these businesses, they're freaking handing over gobs of money, because it's a game of numbers. It's all of a sudden there's 100 businesses handing over $10 per business versus in New York, one business handing over $100, and eventually they're going to leave and it's going to be nothing around. So the infrastructure in Texas is considerably better than New York, and New York has a hell of a lot more tolls, and Texas, I think, just implemented one, because now the state is becoming a little more purple, and younger people are coming who are taking for granted the reason they're there. They're there because they got offered this job, because this company came here because there's low taxes and a low regulatory burden. That's why they're there. And then a lot of these fools, these millennials I'm talking to, I'm here to win you guys over, are coming in there and they're making the state purple, and they're going to turn it blue, and they're so happy to do that. That's completely ignorant. The reason you're there is because there was an abundance of opportunity, because the business environment was friendly, because the legislators are smarter than that of those and people in New York and their legislators. So New Yorkers are getting punished. Jobs are dissipating. They're evaporating completely. There's no end in sight. This is going to keep playing itself out until the state is completely bankrupt, which it will be. The overhead of New York versus the overhead of Texas is entirely different. Same with that of Florida, like I mentioned earlier. I mean, all of the welfare programs, the amount of debt that New York is drowning in compared to that of Texas and Florida is a joke. I mean, what New York should do is, if they're really serious about improving the state and improving prosperity and bring people in there to be more productive and provide some entrepreneurship and something somebody could feel good about in the community and really revitalize these rundown buildings and fucked up roads and all of that stuff. What they would really do is they would just kind of take a ledger of what Texas spends its tax dollars on versus that of themselves and say, how can we become more like Texas? And then there's these built-in things with New York State that it's close to Canada, it's close to Toronto, and Southern Ontario is one of the fastest growing areas economically in North America. So there's these some built-in advantages with tourism and leftover Rust Belt towns that could be remodeled. There's already this built-in infrastructure and this amazing agrarian economy and how beautiful the landscape is. It could be very attractive, but for the taxes and regulations. And then these people move and it separates families, which is awful. It's really, really annoying because if you raise children who are a little bit ambitious and they're not going to go into teaching or, education or medicine, which are jobs that New York's are focusing on, they're basically totalitarianly focusing on. They're going to create these industries and because there's basically just old people to take care of, and really nurse to health and then educate young people just end up leaving. So there's really no businesses. The actual productive part of the economy has been gutted. But it's just really wild to think about all these things. It's really upsetting. It's like, oh my God, we could have a state in New York that could be the envy of the world. And I don't even live in New York right now. I live in Ohio. But what makes me feel good about the United States is states like Texas that are doing the right thing. I mean, Washington, D.C. and the greater United States should take a page out of Texas's playbook. So people are going to say, well, the whole United States-China thing doesn't really make any sense because if we just all act like Texas, we're still never going to be able to compete with the Chinese. Well, yeah, that is fair and true to a certain extent. I get that. But in these second world countries that are becoming first world countries like China and India, Indonesia, all these countries, Vietnam, whatever they are, Brazil, yeah, well, their wages are rising furiously. They're not going to meet that of the United States anytime soon, but what's going to end up happening is there will be some more welfare states born out of this. It's what the tentacles of government do and the Leviathan do. Eventually, they're going to basically rob the private sector of all this wealth and resources and try to redistribute it and just cause chaos and destruction and malaise in the economy. But what I'm getting at is this. Even if the wages aren't going to meet that of people in the United States anytime soon, even in the next 20 or 30 years, there is this basically idea that there's a distribution cost, right? I mean, a car can be manufactured a lot cheaper in Japan or China or some of these other countries. However, and I'm going to pause for 1 second to say this too. I mean, before Trump came around, the United States had the highest corporate tax burden in the world. How does that make any sense? How is that incentivizing anyone to come to the United States and put a factory or business there? But anyway, despite that, what it is the distribution cost piece. So if the wages are rising in China and they're catching up to the U.S., but they're not going to do that in 10 or 20, 30 years, let's still bottom out our taxes like that of Texas. Let's still deregulate aspects of our economy because Adam Smith taught this, the law of comparative advantage. Basically, there's things that we have inherent to the United States that can make us more competitive, and that's why free trade works. But it's not even that. It's the distribution cost piece in the sense that if China's making this car and it costs $20,000 and the U.S. can make it for $15,000, I guess the U.S. can make it for $25,000. Well, if it costs China $5,000 to ship it overseas to get to the U.S. for sale, well, that cost just rises and meets that of the United States. So what I'm saying is this. I'm going to say it one more time. The U.S. makes a car for $25,000. China makes a car for $20,000. People want to buy that car that's cheaper. But in order to get the car to the United States for sale, it might cost $5,000 just to move it over the ocean. So that effectively makes it the same cost as that of the U.S. The problem is we're not in that world right now. We're basically, the spread is so much crazier. It's because of our cumbersome welfare states, because of our cumbersome tax code. It's because of all this bullshit the politicians in the United States are doing. And it's because of the third world, second world becoming first world nation aspect of China, which we already went through. It's the disparity is more like maybe it cost, I don't know, $10,000 to build that car in China versus it cost us $40,000 in the United States. So shrinking that gap might mean us slashing taxes and wages rising in China, but closing that gap also might be that distribution piece I'm talking about. So that could expedite these things. It's worth a try to see when we can kind of close the spread on the distribution cost there. And I don't really know how quick that could happen, but it's definitely a part of it because with food and beverage manufacturing in the United States, I mean, you can't make milk in China, even if they're really good at it and ship it to the U.S. I mean, there's expectancies on this as far as pureness of the goods and whether or not it'll go moldy or go stale or go bad. Same thing with just any produce in the United States. I mean, they're not going to source it from all the way across the world. They can do it internally in the U.S. because next thing you know, you have a longer shelf life or expectancy before it goes stale or moldy, and the consumer can enjoy that better. So some of these things are built-in advantages. Some of them are not. But what our advantage could be is being the rugged, beautiful, independent, strong country that we once were, where it was free enterprise and capitalism reigned supreme and the entrepreneur was respected and private property was respected, and there wasn't free things like healthcare or Social Security or Medicare or any of these programs that were basically just piled onto the backs of the taxpayer and printed by virtue of the federal printing press and all these things encumbering us. It's what countries always do. It's when the times get really, really good, they lose sight of what actually got them there, and they decide, oh, we're just going to redistribute something. It's classic. All of this fucking tomfoolery and buffoonery takes place all over the world. All of these countries, the countries in the Netherlands who have their air quotes socialized medicine and they socialize or socially engineer aspects of the economy. Well, the reason they can get away with that is because at one point they were very, very, very capitalistic. And they decided we're just going to chip into this gold mine as long as we can. And then you're going to be left with nothing. It's going to be poverty. It's going to be no jobs. It's going to be 25% unemployment like in Spain. So the U.S. is just going through that. Right now, we're lucky. We're the reserve currency of the world, the United States, that is. And we basically dictate what goes on with our Federal Reserve printing press. And when the Chinese decide they don't want to buy our treasury notes anymore, these bonds, and they say, fuck you, then we're not going to be living high on the hog anymore. And we're going to have to dig in and we're going to have to deal with the consequences of the Chinese consuming their own goods that they build instead of trading them to us for these counterfeit pieces of paper that are worth nothing in the long run. So just going back, I know I went on a tangent about the global dynamics at place, but I wanted to mirror that of Texas versus New York. So just to encapsulate this again quickly, New York State up there in population, Texas up there in population. What do these states have going for them? New York, nothing economically. Taxes are higher. The regulations are far more insane. The social regulations are more insane. The freedom, the personal liberties, the civil liberties, the freedom of responsibility, the freedom to control your own destiny in New York is severely diminished. And it's because businesses don't want to come there. And it's because of the laws, the legislatures, and the, legal framework makers. And you look at Greg Abbott, who's the governor of Texas. He is a no-nonsense guy who really believes in the free market and free enterprise. And his state is really seeing huge dividends, and they're reaping the rewards of that. Whereas you have Andrew Cuomo is basically a closet Marxist. I mean, nothing, just a little bit short of Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York City. But again, he's basically a socialist, a communist, some sort of Marxist, one of these guys who thinks he can engineer the economy. And everybody in upstate New York hates his guts for the most part, generally speaking. I mean, it's really two different worlds, upstate versus downstate. But then even like all these people who are Democrats, they claim that they hate him and he receives such bad press and on social media and everything he does really just irks people, even in the public sector in New York. And he's always like elected again. Like, I mean, New York State needs to blame themselves. New York City is predominantly liberal. I mean, when you're in a diverse area, you automatically have to check the box of being a Democrat and voting blue and voting for the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes of the world, who is in New York City. But New York State has really just destroyed itself. It's ruined a beautiful thing. It used to be a mansion, and they've since smashed out all the windows, and they haven't kept anything in place. They've scratched all the hardwood floors. They've ruined all the furniture. They let the dog shit all over the floor, and they've really just ruined everything. And people go there for, I guess, the touristy piece and seeing what it once was and reminiscing with their family and friends, whereas Texas is building their mansion right now, and they're not McMansions. They're building up a fucking fortress built on a bedrock of really limestone, and it's going to be a palace, and it'll continue to be so, and people are going to go there, and they're going to build other palaces around that, and that's just the dynamic we have here. People want to be in Texas. People do not want to be in New York, and I'm sick and tired of people not realizing what that is. I mean, if I was in charge of any of these blue states, California, New York, I'd be looking to the states that are doing it right and figuring it out, looking out and actually advocating for the people, because doing the right thing is not redistributing wealth. It's not creating income taxes. It's not creating income tax brackets that benefit one social class over another. It's not handing out food stamps. It's not having a more generous portion of some sort of medical insurance or Medicare that some other states don't have, like Dr. Dinosaur, like Vermont has. I mean, that's basically Dr. Dinosaur. People don't realize this. 0 through 18, people get free, in air quotes, healthcare in Vermont. And there's consequences to that. That's why there's no jobs there. That's why people are leaving there as well. It's the same thing. I mean, Vermont recognizes they cannot afford Medicare for all in terms of just state dollars. They need federal dollars to do that. So the United States just be better off just freeing up all the resources from the federal mitts and letting the states do what they want. So if Vermont wants to do Dr. Dinosaur for the entire citizens tree up from basically cradle to grave, then by all means, they're going to reap the consequences of that. Texas wants the free market stuff and basically private insurance across the board and people paying their own way and all of these things. We'll see where the chips fall. And I think I know how that would work out. I think Texas would be a booming enterprise and it would be amazing. And I think the Vermonts would continue to lag and suffer much like that of New York. So I wanted to show that paradigm. I wanted to show that differentiation, that juxtaposition. I wanted to show Texas versus New York and why Texas will continue to flourish and boom with, decision-making like abolishing the income tax for good, just leaving it at 0%. And while states like New York will continue to suffer into perpetuity, even while people like me are out there and exist, just preaching the truth about the economic climate and how fucked up the state really is. So this is not a knock against New Yorkers. It's not a praise of Texans. It's just explaining to you guys why you guys are in the situation you are in those states and why New Yorkers could stand to learn a lot from Texans despite just moving to Texas. Maybe they can advocate in their local legislators, tell Governor Cuomo to fuck off in as many words as such. And again, that's all I got for episode 10. I'm glad I made it this far, and hopefully you guys learned a little bit about the economics behind Texas versus that of New York. Have a great day.